Okay, we're wrapping up here, the last panel, and it's been a really great day. So again, thank you to SPC and the team for putting this event on. My name is Byron Stauffer. I'm the Executive Director of the Indiana County Office of Planning and Development, and I'm pleased today to moderate the distinguished guests here, the panelists for the Pennsylvania Statewide Implementation Plan and Summary of Regional Efforts. I think it was very strategic for the SPC team to put these two gentlemen at the end, so we still have a good crowd. It's been a long day, and just a great series of panels throughout the day. A lot of good information, very worthy of our time and attention throughout the day. I did want to take a moment of personal privilege, if I may, and just very briefly, it was great to see an old friend, Sherry Collins. And Sherry, I know most of us in this room, I think it was pre-COVID, BC, whatever you want to call it. Her leadership to many of us at the counties and the municipalities, leading us through. I mean, many of us started broadband prior to, but really with the rush of calls from superintendents and people and residents and businesses that are unserved or underserved, her leadership was paramount, and her role, as the governor's state alternate at ARC was paramount. We were fortunate enough to win a $1.5 million ARC Power Grant. So again, thank you, Sherry, for your leadership. Appreciate it greatly. So I'm pleased to honor today, again, our panelists. We have with us today Brandon Carson, the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Broadband Development Authority, and Dr. Kyle Kopko, Executive Director for the Center for Rural Pennsylvania. Little housekeeping note. Again, I think you're well versed in the procedure, but throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, please write them on an index card, raise them up, and someone will come get them and bring them forth. So we have a little less than 30 minutes now, so really want to get into the presentations. These two gentlemen have put forth some really good PowerPoint information, and by virtue of a virtual flip, Dr. Kyle Kopko won the honors of going first.
Thank you very much, Byron. And it's so good to see so many friends here today. Thank you to SPC for hosting us. I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague, Brandon Carson, to talk about some of the work of the Broadband Authority. And I wanted to give a lay of the land, more or less, of what we're seeing in rural Pennsylvania relative to our urban communities. And that's what the first part of my presentation is going to be about, and then also getting into some demographic comparisons too. So I think that ties in with some of the equity and digital literacy themes that we've been discussing throughout the day. So next slide, please. Just as some background, I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Rural Pennsylvania. For those of you who might not be familiar with us, we're part of the Pennsylvania General Assembly. So we are a bicameral, bipartisan office of the legislature, and we basically have two broad mandates per our enabling legislation. So the first is we conduct applied policy research on behalf of the General Assembly, but we also do this in a manner that can benefit county commissioners, local municipalities, school district officials, nonprofits, you name it, on a wide range of topics: healthcare, transportation, economic development. Anything along those lines is fair game for the Center for Rural Pennsylvania. And then we also maintain a pretty comprehensive statistical database where we track trends in both rural and urban communities, so that way we can do a comparison. And we'll use some of that data here later on. We also have the ability to host legislative hearings. We actually have one coming up next month on the opioid crisis and substance use disorder crisis in rural Pennsylvania, so a wide range of issues in addition to broadband. So if we can ever be of assistance, please be in touch. That's an open invitation for anyone here. So next slide, please. And just to give you a quick background on some of our recent research reports, anything from social determinants of health, assessment of housing stock in rural communities, how COVID affected education programs. We're going to have a few reports out later this year looking at population projections out to 2050. We're hoping to do this 5-year increments for every single county in the Commonwealth. So that way it'll help with long-term planning. In fact, next week we're hoping to release a report on mobile data for cell phones. So we'll have that out shortly too. So you might be interested in that. Next slide, please. So what is rural in Pennsylvania? We actually have our own definition that's used by the legislature and a number of state agencies. This is our county definition here. So you can see the bulk of the Commonwealth is considered rural by this definition. It's essentially population density. You take the average population density across the state. If you're below that, you're considered a rural area. If you're above that, you're considered an urban area. Now, we also have school district and municipal definitions as well. There's pockets of rural in every single county except for Philadelphia County and Delaware County. So obviously, much of the SPC region is considered rural by our definition. And all these slides, we can make this available too if anyone would like a copy. Just send me an email. Next slide, please. All right, so what have we seen in Pennsylvania over time? And this contextualizes the time and place in which the Broadband Authority operates. This is what we've seen in terms of our population in the Commonwealth over time. The purple line here represents urban communities based on our county definition, and the green bars represent our rural communities. So we've essentially seen population stagnation over time in our rural communities. We actually had a little bit of a decline since the last census, but our urban communities population has increased over time. Next slide, please. And this maps it out, changes since the 2010 census, and what we refer to broadly as the Southeast. It's not just Philadelphia and the collar counties. It's basically from Philadelphia all the way to Franklin County. That's where we've seen the most growth in the Commonwealth, but there's obviously other pockets of growth that have occurred during that period of time, and particularly in the SPC region, Butler, Allegheny, and Washington counties that had population growth based upon our last 2020 census data that's available. So you can see many of our rural counties have seen population decline over time, and there's a wide variety of reasons for that. In short, this is something that we're going to be paying a lot of attention to over time, and I think related to the Broadband Authority's work, broadband's going to play a pretty big role, I think, in helping to stave off some of these trends. I view it as a necessary, but not necessarily sufficient condition to address a lot of these major issues. Next slide, please. And just to give you a sense of the spending capacity between urban and rural, these two lines here denote per capita income, and it's also controls for inflation over time. So you can see that there is a gap between urban and rural income over time, about $15,000 as of the 2020 capture dates. So again, tying into our discussions about ACP and affordability, better understanding how those communities across Pennsylvania differ is going to be pretty important. Next slide, please. How many people have seen this before? Just about everyone. All right, good. This is a screen capture of the FCC map, and I just wanted to point out the data, and I also wanted to reiterate something that Lyle said in the last presentation. Please do encourage your constituents to go online and complete the challenge form if they see any inaccuracies over time. This is obviously a living product. This is what the Commonwealth looks like on the FCC's website for the 25.3 threshold for wired and licensed fixed wireless. And the next slide will actually show for 120 downloads. So next. So there you can see where the pockets are that are mostly unserved at that threshold. Now, to break this down by county, we've provided some data on the next map here. Please, next slide. And this is all from the broadband map available from the FCC. You can download this, your constituents can download this, and we were able to plot this out for the entire Commonwealth. And you can see what percentage of units, according to the map, have service at the 25.3 speed. So within the SPC region, Greene County and Indiana County have some catching up to do. And we'll go to the next slide for 120, and you can see a similar pattern there. Next slide. And here's where I wanted to point out some demographic and differences amongst individuals over time in terms of their internet connectivity. And this is information that comes from the US Census Bureau. Some of you might have seen this if you're at the Institute of Politics presentation that I gave in December. We updated this just a little bit for some new data. The bar chart's on the left. I want to point that out. So this is a measure of who has internet, period. It could be dial-up, it could be DSL. It's not necessarily broadband. And this is based on the census survey. And so the bars on the left are rural, the ones on the right, urban. You can see there's been some progress over time. So that's the good news. And that's been an ongoing effort thanks to people like you having these conversations, moving it forward. So I think that we're heading in the right direction. Don't get me wrong, we still have more to do, but we are at least heading in the right direction. But who doesn't have access? Who isn't uptaking for whatever reason, either because it's physically not available or they can't afford it or anything of the sort? And there's a ton of numbers here. So I've actually highlighted some of these point by point. I just want to give you a brief flavor of what we might want to look at in terms of equity issues. So next, let's see if this works here with some of the highlights. There we go. All right, average age. If you look at the first two columns there, these are individuals who do not have internet. The first column is rural households. Second column is urban households. The third one are just households across the Commonwealth that do have internet. What you'll see is there's some similarities between these individuals regardless of whether or not they live in a rural or urban area. So one thing, getting back to our legislative panel from earlier today, yeah, there seems to be a lot of identities about rural versus urban. Well, what my office deals with time and time again is that there's some commonalities whenever we face some problems. The solution might look different depending on where you live, but oftentimes, no matter where you are, urban or rural, you normally have these commonalities. So I think that's something as community leaders, policymakers, we need to keep in mind. So here, those who don't have internet, they tend to be older. Relative to those who do. So they're well into their 60s. Next. Click one more time, please. Household income. Those with internet tend to have household income in the $70,000 range. Those who don't are in the $25-ish thousand range. Next, please. One more. Poverty rate. You're basically twice as likely to live in poverty if you don't have internet connectivity. Next. Percent living alone, more than 60%, regardless if you're in rural or urban, likely to be living alone if you don't have internet versus 27% of households that do have internet. Next one, please. No high school diploma, more than 20% in rural and urban who don't have internet. Next. Not in the labor force, so not employed. Look at those numbers there, 70+% rural and urban. Next, please. I think this is interesting and troubling all at the same time. Percent of households with a disability, roughly 40%, regardless if you're in a rural or urban community versus only 16% those who do have internet connectivity. So I think that's the environment in which we need to be aware of when we're talking about broadband build out, equity, access, digital literacy, all those major topics. So Center for Rural Pennsylvania would be more than happy to provide any of this information to anyone here today. If we can ever be a partner for long-term planning, feel free to reach out anytime. Since we are a government-funded entity, we don't charge for our services, so we're here to serve, obviously, the legislature, county commissioners, school districts, but anyone in the public who might have an interest. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Brandon.
Thank you, Dr. Kopko. And who told the dad joke this morning? Who was that? That's right, it was Nicole. She's still here? She stepped out. I have one for you. It's the end of the day, so who's out of bandwidth? Yeah, hilarious, right? So I noticed during Dr. Kopko's slide deck, he and I both like to click through slides apparently because you don't notice it until we were told the clicker isn't working, so that's why we're asking to advance slides. But you don't realize it until you ask every time to advance a slide. So with that being said, next slide. All right, so a little background on the authority. I know I touched on this this morning, but I wanted to make sure we focused in on the funding at that session, and that this afternoon we dug a little bit more into the structure of the authority. So Act 96 is the legislation that created the authority. This was passed late 2021 at record speed. This flew through the legislature. It was absolutely necessary. It was clear that the federal funds were going to be available, and Act 96 was the result of that and the creation of the authority. So how many folks are familiar with the Commonwealth Financing Authority, CFA? Okay. We're structured in a very similar way to the CFA. The authority is staffed by DCED, so there is an MOU in place for staffing between DCED and the authority. And then we're governed by an 11-member board. Dr. Kopko serves on the board, along with the chairwoman of the PUC, 4 legislative members, Representatives Matsey and Metzger, and Senators Phillips Hill and Kane. So we have that bipartisan structure on the board, 2 Rs, 2 Ds, 2 from the House, 2 from the Senate, as well as 5 secretaries from state agencies. So it is a unique dynamic on that 11-member board. So next slide. So I want to touch on the state plan just a little bit. The board adopted a statewide plan back in November, and Act 96 required that we develop and approve a statewide plan within 12 months of the act being signed into law. So we met that timing requirement. Don't confuse this with the 5-year action plan that we've been talking a lot about. The state plan as it exists in its current form is very much broad strokes, principles that we want to keep in mind. And you've heard a lot of those principles today in the various panels. And kudos to SPC, if I don't say this at the end, for the panels that have been put together today, because there's been a lot of great content, and the themes that you see in the state plan were articulated again and again by each of the panelists. So that was encouraging for me. Next slide, please. So focusing on kind of the 4 pillars of the plan, access to infrastructure. We all know that's a critical part of the work that we're doing. Affordability. For those folks that do have access, can they afford that reliable high-speed internet service? Do they have an adequate device to fully experience the services that are offered through a high-speed connection? And then lastly, assistance. I remember those by the 4 A's. So technical assistance. Do they have the digital literacy skills they need to navigate through a device and adequately use the services that are available? So those are the 4 pillars of the plan. They will serve as a foundation as we develop the 5-year action plan, and we get much more granular with the development of that plan in the coming months leading up to that mid-August deadline for NTIA submission. Next slide, please. So I touched on this morning. I think we had a question on workforce considerations. We did stand up a series of 4 subcommittees to help to inform authority staff as well as the authority board as we delve deeper into the water here on some of the planning work that needs to be done prior to implementation. Next slide. Those 4 groups probably aren't a surprise. Data and mapping, a technical group that includes some provider representation from their various associations, workforce and supply chain, and outreach and education round out those 4 subcommittees. They're meeting on a regular basis. Some are meeting twice a month, some are meeting monthly. But I'm starting to hear a lot of good themes percolating out of those groups from the staff that have been assigned each of those subcommittees. So we're excited about the work they'll be doing alongside the consultant that we bring on board for the 5-year action plan and the statewide digital equity plan. Next slide. So IIJA, we touched on the funding pretty extensively this morning. So I'm not going to go through this in detail. I did want to include the information in the slide deck There are some timelines that might be good takeaways for you all. I know there are a lot of moving pieces, things that need to happen sequentially before these dollars start to be pushed out through our grant programs. So I did leave the slides in the deck, but I'm not going to talk through these extensively. So next slide. BEAD, Digital Equity Act, and Middle Mile. I think we've touched on all three of those this morning on some level. Next slide. First being BEAD with the $42+ billion in funding, and that has been a lot of the focus. One thing I will mention here that I don't know that we discussed this morning, the federal guidance on this is very specific in that as we are considering investments through the BEAD program, we need to prioritize based on need. First priority, those areas that are unserved, lack access to 25.3. Second priority, those areas that are underserved or lack access to 100 by 20. And lastly, as a third priority, digital anchor institutions that may lack gig up, gig down, synchronous connections. And as I mentioned, there is a timeline included there. That's been very beneficial for us and our team as we're kind of tracking this out and what happens when. So next slide. Digital Equity Act, as Nicole touched on this morning, there are some additional funds available here. There will be some formula funds that each of the states will receive through a total of $1.44 billion. We don't yet know what our allocation will be here in Pennsylvania, but those dollars will be allocated and available for various programs that the authority will stand up. There's also a little over $1 billion available through a competitive program that we will be able to apply for in the coming years. Next slide. Middle Mile, this program closed back at the end of September. We had a pretty good response in the Commonwealth in terms of applications that were submitted. We supported quite a few applications. The Commonwealth did not coordinate a single application on this. We took the approach of supporting incumbent providers that were proposing middle mile infrastructure builds. So those applications are under review at NTIA, and I know there are folks patiently waiting for announcements on those funds. Next slide. So the Capital Projects Fund, I talked a little bit about this morning, and you can go ahead to the next. Three components, and I touched on the $200 million. This is the first program we're going to be standing up. These are the American Rescue Plan dollars that I had referenced. $279 million total, $200 million that we've dedicated to a core infrastructure program. We're working on guidelines for that now. We have a kind of a request for information that has been pushed out. We issued a press release on that last week. If you jump on our website, you can take a look at some of the information we're requesting. The guidance from Treasury on these funds is fairly prescriptive. However, we do have some flexibility in certain areas. So those are the areas that we're looking for some information on from you all, from providers, local governments, nonprofits, other partners, other stakeholders, in how we stand up this initial $200 million program. So these funds will be the first funds awarded by the authority. Likely later this year, we'll be looking at grant awards through the initial program. We're also targeting $45 million for digital anchor institutions. These would be facility upgrades to our anchor institutions, understanding that folks are accessing services at those facilities. We wanted to dedicate some funds for those purposes, and $20 million for a device access program that we're looking at pushing out likely later this calendar year. Next slide. And I touched on this. The feedback that we've requested is due by February 23rd. So that is quickly approaching. We're moving fast on these guidelines, and we want to get the program stood up and open for applications as quickly as possible. Next slide. So a takeaway slide, and you can scan through. Next slide. Takeaway slide for you, just in terms of timing and some key milestones that we're looking at in our planning processes. We're actively building staff capacity at the office. When I started back in May, So I guess today would be actually my 9-month anniversary. I think Nicole said that she is celebrating 1 year, right? So yeah, it's been 9 months for me, and I had jet black hair 9 months ago. But it comes with the territory. We are still actively working to add staff capacity. There are 6 of us currently in the office. We have a complement of 11 planned, and we may grow beyond that depending on need. We fully expect there to be an enormous amount of interest in these funds when these programs are stood up. So if we need to add capacity, there are resources available there for the authority to do that. So we are working to launch our digital equity and BEAD planning efforts. Now I mentioned that we're working to onboard a consultant or consultants to help with that process. Julia Brinjak is here with me today. She's been working on our outreach stakeholder engagement plan and starting to solicit some feedback on that plan. So we're trying to hit the ground running even in advance of bringing on a consultant. Some of the work that we can do in-house, we've already gotten started on. So looking ahead to likely releasing capital project fund guidelines next month, pending board approval, and opening that round of applications in April. At least that's the plan where we sit today, if all goes as planned. And then moving forward to the August timeframe when we have to have the BEAD 5-year action plan complete. That's a big milestone for us. State Digital Equity Plan is due in October, and then we start to look at implementation activities next year, which is where we all very much want to get to, where we have these dollars available for our grant programs that we can start to dole out and start to meet some of the needs in your communities. Next slide. That's the extent of my slide deck. I guess we probably have some questions.
Yes. So we thank you for your presentations, very informative. And as expected, we do have a number of questions. First one here is that was presented, do or could capital project funds or anchor institutions include getting broadband to municipal buildings in rural areas?
Yeah, the short answer would be yes. That would be an eligible project. The project would need to meet the speed requirements outlined by Treasury. And we are working to avoid any overbuilds with CPF. There isn't any specific guidance on overbuilds like there is with BEAD. But without too much context there with the question, the short answer would be it would be ineligible. It's good. Yeah.
Another question submitted by the audience for the capital program funds, the CPF funds. Is there flexibility on who can apply? And the questionnaire is wondering if a county with a plan can apply without an ISP partner lined up already.
Yeah, so there is a lot of flexibility in terms of who can apply. Local governments, for-profit entities, nonprofits, cooperatives. It's the whole gamut of folks, and that it's going to take the entire lineup for the work that we have ahead of us. So yes, there's flexibility in who can apply, and a local government would be eligible to apply as the draft guidelines exist today. Nothing has been approved yet. I will caveat that. But local governments would be eligible to apply without a direct partnership with the ISPs.
Very good. Another question from the audience. When do you expect the CPF program applications to be due if they open in April? And I guess a follow-on question to that is, when might we see awards moving forward?
Yeah, so there are several moving pieces there. Act 96 requires that we open our application round for at least 60 days, so no less than 60 days, no more than 120 days. That is specifically in the Act. We're looking in around that 60 to 90-day window for the application period to be open. Act 96 also requires that we post criteria 30 days in advance of opening that round of applications. So we have billed built that into our time frame. Looking ahead to after applications would be due, Act 96 requires us to go through a challenge process to ensure that we're avoiding overbuild situations. So that is something that we're actively developing what that process looks like now. We're targeting before the end of the calendar year to make awards through this initial $200 million in capital projects.
Thank you. And another question would be, would a decrease in poverty rates be a KPI for these programs? Follow-on would be infrastructure, devices, and training should yield socioeconomic benefits, but I'm curious if any of that is measured. How will PA define success?
Yes, so that is something we're still working through. And I mentioned the work that Penn State is doing with the statewide map this morning. And as we work to layer in more data sets to help to inform our decision-making process, poverty rate is something that obviously would be included as a layer in that map as part of that decision-making tool. But we still have work to do on that front as we gear up for this round of CPF.
Thank you, Brandon. And kind of wrapping up here, I think we're upon our time. But I did want to offer Dr. Kopko a question here, given the audience. Didn't want them left out. Yeah. So what data can local governments provide to support the authority's planning efforts?
Good question. So there's going to be a couple things, I think, in the future, especially as grant guidelines roll out. If there's any detailed information about on-the-ground conditions, that's going to be very helpful in the grant application process, I have no doubt. But back to what Lyle said earlier, if municipalities know of any inaccuracies in the map, please let the Broadband Authority know. Please report that to the FCC through their process, because there's new construction happening all the time, and we need the best data that we can possibly have. The other thing, too, is Brandon and his team opened up a public comment period on a wide variety of questions for the capital projects funds. Please provide feedback on that. And all of our meetings are open to the public. Our subcommittee meetings are open to the public. So if you have thoughts or suggestions on things that we ought to be considering, please be in touch. Let us know. Pennsylvania is a very big, diverse state. We have a saying in my office, if you've seen one rural community, you've seen one rural community. So we don't know what we don't know. And if folks have unique information, share that with us. That'll help us do our jobs better.
Okay. We good? Okay, very good. Well, I thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Again, did want to thank our panelists, Brandon and Kyle. Thank you for your time and your expertise. At this time, I'd like to introduce